It was a snowy Christmas Eve, and Alan had just settled into his new apartment in a quaint mountain town, where the winters painted everything in a serene blanket of white. This was supposed to be a fresh start after a particularly difficult year, a place where he could rediscover himself, far from the noise of the city. The locals were friendly, the kind who waved hello as you passed, and Alan quickly grew fond of his new routine. However, this year, Christmas felt lonely. With no family nearby and just a handful of friends, he planned to spend the evening watching holiday classics and sipping mulled wine. A knock at the door startled Alan as he was wrapping a blanket around himself. The clock read 8:15 p.m., and he wasn't expecting anyone. A strange flutter of unease settled in his chest, but he brushed it off. When he peeked through the peephole, a cheerful-looking man in his late 40s stood outside. He was dressed in an odd mishmash of Christmas attire, an oversized Santa hat and a sweater adorned with garish reindeer patterns. "Evening," the man greeted with a booming, jovial voice when Alan opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock on. "Name's Joe. I'm your upstairs neighbor. Thought I'd come by to wish you a Merry Christmas and, well, extend a little holiday cheer." He lifted a plate of cookies, smiling widely. "Oh, thanks," Alan replied, unhooking the chain. He wasn't sure how to decline without seeming rude. Joe stepped in uninvited, his presence filling the room with an odd energy. He placed the cookies on Alan's coffee table and started talking, fast, as if he'd been waiting to unload stories onto someone all day. Joe's stories were mundane at first, touching on his work as a handyman and a shared love for classic Christmas movies. Yet, something about his demeanor made Alan uneasy. Joe's smile was stretched too wide, his laughter a little too loud, and his gaze often lingered on Alan for a moment too long. Still, Alan felt compelled to be polite. As the evening dragged on, Alan noticed subtle inconsistencies in Joe's stories. His laugh faltered when Alan questioned how long he'd lived in the building, and his gaze darkened when Alan mentioned the landlord, a kind older woman named Diane. "I'm new here," Joe muttered after an awkward pause. "Diane's a sweetheart, isn't she? Always looking out for her tenants." But the way he said it didn't feel right. Alan's unease deepened. Then came the incident with the cookies. While Joe rambled on about holiday traditions, Alan picked one up to be polite. The scent was faintly off, like a mix of cinnamon and something chemical. He pretended to take a bite, but pocketed it when Joe wasn't looking. "You know, Alan," Joe said suddenly, leaning in closer, his jovial tone shifting into something colder, more deliberate. "This place is quite the history. Ever heard about the last tenant in your unit?" Alan froze. He hadn't, but now he was wary of what Joe might say. "No, I haven't." Joe's smile widened again, but this time, it felt predatory. "Oh, Diane doesn't like to talk about it. Poor fellow disappeared one winter night, just like tonight. Actually, police said he probably skipped town, but I have my doubts." The air grew thick with tension. Alan forced a chuckle, trying to deflect. "Well, that's not exactly the Christmas story I was hoping for tonight." Joe didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I'm just saying these walls, they hear things, see things. You'd be surprised." Alan decided it was time to end the visit. "Well, Joe, I really appreciate the cookies, but I've got an early morning tomorrow." Joe didn't budge. Instead, he reached for the remote on Alan's coffee table and flipped the TV to static. The sound of white noise filled the room, and Joe tilted his head, as if listening to something. "Do you hear that?" Joe whispered, his voice almost reverent. "They're speaking." Alan stood, his heart pounding. "All right, that's enough. I think you should go." Joe finally rose, his towering frame casting a shadow across the room. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Merry Christmas, Alan. Don't let the ghosts keep you up." With that, he left, the sound of his heavy boots echoing in the hallway. Alan locked the door immediately and checked all the windows, his pulse racing. He pulled out the cookie from his pocket and decided to test his suspicion. Breaking it open, he found a tiny shard of glass embedded in the dough. His blood ran cold. He called Diane immediately to ask about Joe, but she seemed puzzled. "Joe? I don't have a tenant named Joe. Are you sure he said he lived upstairs?" The line went silent for a moment before she added, "Alan, there's no one upstairs. That unit's been vacant for months." A sudden thud upstairs sent Alan scrambling for his phone. He dialed 911 and whispered his situation to the operator, his voice trembling. As he waited, he heard footsteps above him, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. When the police arrived, they found no one upstairs. The unit was completely empty, save for a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Yet, the officers confirmed fresh footprints in the snow outside Alan's window, leading into the woods. That night, Alan barely slept. Every creak of the building made him jump, and the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. By morning, he had packed his belongings and left for a hotel, vowing never to spend another Christmas alone. Months later, Alan received a call from Diane. She sounded shaken. "Alan, we finally got the upstairs unit cleared out. There was something under the floorboards." "What?" Alan asked, his throat dry. "A skeleton," Diane whispered, wrapped in a Santa suit. On the edge of a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the woods, an old Christmas tradition had faded into myth. People whispered about a mysterious, gifting man who once visited homes during the holiday season. Unlike Santa Claus, the gifting man wasn't associated with joy or warmth. No one could recall when the tales began, but everyone knew the warning. If you hear the gifting man knock, don't answer the door. Don't take his gifts. Don't let him in. Megan and her younger brother, Owen, had heard these stories their whole lives. They grew up in the isolated town, where winters were harsh and neighbors were few. Their family home, a creaky Victorian house with drafty windows and sagging floors, sat at the edge of the forest. This year, their parents were away, visiting an ailing relative several states over. Megan, 18 and resourceful, was tasked with watching over 10-year-old Owen. It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm outside was relentless. Winds howled through the trees, and the windows rattled in their frames. Megan and Owen had planned a cozy evening with hot cocoa and movies, their parents' absence only a minor inconvenience. The old stories about the gifting man were the last thing on their minds. As the night deepened, the house felt colder. Megan adjusted the thermostat, but it didn't seem to help. She noticed the lights flickering slightly, but she chalked it up to the storm. Owen, in his pajamas and fuzzy slippers, sat cross-legged on the couch, watching a cartoon Christmas special. Then came the first knock. It was soft, deliberate, and echoed faintly through the house. Megan and Owen exchanged a glance. No one should have been out in this weather, and their nearest neighbor was a mile away. "Probably just the wind," Megan said, trying to keep her voice steady. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, measured taps. It was unmistakably human. Owen's eyes widened. "Megan, do you think it's him?" Megan hesitated. She hated that Owen still believed in those silly stories, but something about the sound unsettled her. "It's not the gifting man, Owen. There's no such thing. Just stay here. I'll check." The front door loomed at the end of the dim hallway. Megan approached cautiously, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The knocking came again, louder this time. She peered through the peephole. No one was there. Megan let out a shaky breath, relieved but confused. She turned to head back to the living room when she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time from the back door. The house was old, with creaking floorboards and uneven walls, and the layout made it easy to hear sounds from room to room. But this knocking was too precise, too deliberate. "Owen, stay on the couch," Megan called as she hurried to the kitchen, where the back door was located. She peeked through the curtain, and her stomach dropped. A small, neatly wrapped present sat on the snow-dusted porch. There was no sign of anyone who could have left it, just the swirling snow and the shadowed edge of the woods beyond. "What is it?" Owen asked, having crept up behind her. Megan jumped and turned. "I told you to stay put." "Is it a gift?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and dread. "It's nothing," Megan snapped, her nerves fraying. She locked the door and pulled the curtain shut. "Go sit down." But Owen didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the kitchen window. "There's another one," he whispered. Megan followed his line of sight. Outside the window, another gift had appeared, identical to the first, small, square, wrapped in crimson paper with a shiny green bow. A chill ran down Megan's spine. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything other than the knocking. She grabbed her phone to call their parents, but the call wouldn't connect. The storm had knocked out the signal. "Megan," Owen said, his voice trembling. "The stories say he leaves gifts before he comes inside." "There's no he, Owen," Megan said firmly, though her hands were shaking. "This is just some prank. Some weirdo out in the storm. We're fine." But as the minutes passed, the knocking continued. Sometimes it came from the front door, sometimes the back, sometimes the windows. Always 3 knocks. And with every knock, another gift appeared. By midnight, the porch and the windowsills were littered with packages. Megan and Owen stayed huddled in the living room, the curtains drawn and the doors locked. The gifts seemed to inch closer to the house, as though an unseen force were arranging them. Then the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fireplace. Owen whimpered, clutching Megan's arm. "He's coming, isn't he?" "No," Megan said, though she no longer believed it herself. "We just need to wait out the storm." But the storm wasn't the problem. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it was no longer confined to 3 knocks. It became a cacophony, pounding on every door and window, shaking the walls, echoing in their skulls. The sound was deafening. Megan grabbed a flashlight and clutched Owen's hand. "We're going upstairs. Now." They fled to her bedroom and barricaded the door with furniture. The knocking followed them, as if the gifting man knew exactly where they were. It came from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath their feet. It was relentless. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Megan and Owen sat in the corner of the room, too scared to move. Hours passed. Dawn was approaching. They thought it might finally be over. But then they heard the creak of a floorboard outside the bedroom door. Megan's breath caught. She hadn't heard footsteps all night, only the knocking. This was different. This was inside. "Megan," Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if he's in the house?" "Shoo," Megan hissed, her mind racing. She didn't have a weapon, didn't have a plan. All she had was a flashlight and her brother to protect. The door handle jiggled. Once, twice. Then it stopped. Megan tightened her grip on Owen, her pulse pounding in her ears. The silence stretched on, unbearable. And then, a voice. Soft, cheerful, inhuman. "Open the door," it said. "It's Christmas. I have a gift for you." Megan bit back a scream. The voice was wrong. High-pitched, like a child's, but layered with something deeper, more guttural. "Go away," she shouted, her voice breaking. The voice chuckled. "You can't stop me. I'll leave it here for you." A soft thud followed, as if something had been placed on the floor outside the door. Then the footsteps retreated, growing fainter and fainter, until they disappeared entirely. Megan and Owen didn't move until daylight filtered through the curtains. When Megan finally mustered the courage to open the door, she found a single gift sitting on the floor. She didn't touch it. Instead, she and Owen ran downstairs and out into the snow, leaving the house behind. They found help at a neighbor's house, and when they returned later with the police, the house was empty. The gifts outside were gone, as was the one upstairs. The only evidence that anything had happened was the front door, which was wide open, its lock shattered from the inside. No one believed their story. The storm, they said, must have rattled the house. The gifts? Probably an elaborate prank by a bored neighbor. But Megan knew the truth. She could still hear the knocking in her dreams, still hear the voice promising gifts she would never dare accept. She and Owen never spent another Christmas in that house. It was the kind of cold that clung to your bones, a bitter chill that even the roaring fireplace in the old family cabin couldn't shake. Ellie arrived there with her boyfriend, Daniel, just 2 days before Christmas, seeking an escape from the chaos of the city. This cabin, tucked deep in the snowy forests of Maine, had been in Ellie's family for generations. It was old and creaky, but charming in its simplicity, surrounded by towering pines and endless silence. Ellie had fond childhood memories of spending Christmases here with her parents. But things were different now. Her parents were gone, victims of a car crash 5 years earlier, and the cabin had sat empty ever since. This was her first time returning, and though it felt comforting to be surrounded by the memories, something about the stillness unnerved her. "Do you smell that?" Ellie asked as she unpacked their groceries. Daniel sniffed the air and shrugged. "Just smells like wood smoke to me." But Ellie shook her head. "No, it's something else. Like sweet. Like rotting fruit or something." Daniel laughed. "Maybe the pantry's got some old canned peaches hiding out. Don't worry, babe. I'll take a look later." Ellie tried to push the strange scent out of her mind. She had bigger things to focus on, like getting the cabin ready for the storm that was rolling in. Heavy snow was forecasted, and the weather up here could turn dangerous quickly. They spent the day sealing drafty windows and ensuring they had enough wood for the fireplace. By evening, the snow had started to fall. It was light at first, swirling lazily around the cabin in a way that felt almost magical. Ellie and Daniel cooked dinner, drank hot cocoa, and settled in to watch an old Christmas movie on Ellie's laptop. For the first time in months, Ellie felt like she could relax. Then the knocking started. It was soft, almost tentative, and came from the front door. Daniel paused the movie, frowning. Who the hell would be out here in this weather? Ellie's heart sank. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and no one knew they were here. "Maybe it's an animal," she suggested weakly. "An animal knocking?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. The knock came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel stood, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Ellie wanted to protest, but fear rooted her to the couch. She watched as Daniel opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight out into the snow. "No one's there," he called back, his voice tinged with confusion. He stepped outside, scanning the area. Just footprints. Footprints? That was worse than nothing. Ellie got up and joined him on the porch, pulling her coat tight against the cold. Sure enough, there were footprints leading up to the door, bare footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they stopped abruptly at the porch steps. Ellie shivered. "Where do you think they came from?" Daniel frowned, shining the flashlight into the woods. "I don't see any other tracks. It's like they just stopped here." They both stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. Ellie felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, though she couldn't see anything beyond the swirling snow. "Let's go inside," she whispered. Daniel nodded, locking the door behind them. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Ellie couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every gust of wind more ominous. Even the firelight, which usually made the cabin feel cozy, seemed to cast long, sinister shadows. Around midnight, Ellie woke to the sound of faint giggling. Her heart hammered in her chest as she sat up, straining to hear. It sounded like a child, soft, high-pitched, and playful. The sound was faint, as though it were coming from outside. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Daniel groaned, half asleep. "What?" "The laughing," Ellie insisted. "Listen." But the sound was gone. "It's just the wind," Daniel mumbled, rolling over. "Go back to sleep." Ellie tried, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about the footprints, how small they were, how there had been no sign of where they'd come from. And the smell, that strange, sickly sweet scent, seemed stronger now. Finally, unable to ignore her unease, Ellie got up and walked to the window. The snow was falling heavily now, but she could just make out the edge of the woods. And there, standing at the tree line, was a figure. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The figure was small, no taller than a child, and it wore a tattered white nightgown. Its head tilted upward, as though it were looking directly at her. Ellie couldn't make out any features in the dim light, but she could feel its gaze. The giggling started again. Ellie stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and landing hard on the floor. The sound stopped abruptly. When she scrambled back to the window, the figure was gone. "Daniel!" she cried, rushing to the bedroom. "What now?" he groaned, sitting up. "There's someone outside," Ellie shouted. "A child or something." Daniel was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his flashlight and boots. "Stay here," he said firmly, already heading for the door. Wait, don't go out there, Ellie begged, grabbing his arm, but Daniel shook her off. It's probably just a kid lost in the storm. I'll be fine. He stepped out into the snow before Ellie could stop him. She watched from the window as his flashlight beam danced through the darkness, scanning the woods. Hello, he called. Is someone there? No response. Hey kid, if you're out here, you need to come inside. It's not safe. Still nothing. Daniel turned back toward the cabin, shaking his head. But then, just as he reached the porch, Ellie saw something move behind him. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched a shadow dart between the trees. Quick, almost too quick to register. Daniel didn't seem to notice. Ellie, there's no one here, he said as he stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. But I saw, she began, her voice trembling. Daniel cut her off. It's the storm messing with your head. Let's just go to bed. Ellie wanted to argue, but she could see that Daniel was exhausted and frustrated. Reluctantly, she followed him back to bed. But as she lay there in the dark, listening to the howling wind, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They weren't. The storm raged through the night, battering the cabin with relentless gusts of wind and snow that seemed determined to smother every inch of it. Ellie couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified. The groan of the wooden beams, the howl of the wind, the faint, lingering giggle that haunted her ears. She finally drifted off sometime before dawn, but her sleep was shallow and filled with disjointed dreams of pale faces and icy hands clawing at the windows. When she woke, the cabin was eerily silent. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow covering the ground. But the calm outside did nothing to soothe her growing anxiety. Daniel was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, his demeanor much lighter than the previous night. See, he said when he noticed Ellie standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. The storm's over, and there's nothing to worry about. Just some spooky weather and overactive imaginations. Ellie wanted to believe him, but her gaze was drawn to the window. The snow outside was untouched, save for one thing: footprints. Small, child-sized footprints leading away from the cabin and into the woods. She stiffened. Daniel, look. Daniel followed her gaze, frowning. That's weird, he admitted, setting his mug down. I don't remember seeing those last night. They weren't there last night, Ellie said firmly. It was snowing too hard. Those are fresh. Okay, Daniel said slowly. So, maybe there really was a kid out there. They probably left when the storm cleared up. In the middle of the night? In a storm? Ellie snapped, her voice rising. Barefoot? Daniel, this doesn't make sense. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, I'll check it out. But I'm telling you, it's probably nothing. Ellie followed him to the door, dread pooling in her stomach. She watched as he pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed his flashlight despite the daylight, and stepped outside. She stayed on the porch, shivering against the cold, as he crouched to examine the tracks. They just lead into the woods, Daniel called over his shoulder. Nothing unusual. Ellie shook her head. You don't find that strange? No other tracks, no sign of anyone coming back? Daniel shrugged, standing. It's weird, sure, but it's not like we're dealing with ghosts or monsters here, Ellie. She wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. She watched as Daniel followed the tracks into the woods, the dense trees quickly swallowing him. He disappeared from view, leaving her alone on the porch. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Daniel, she called, her voice shaking. No response. Ellie felt a surge of panic. She grabbed her own coat and boots, hesitating only a moment before plunging into the woods after him. The snow was deep, and the cold bit at her face, but she pushed forward, following the trail of footprints and Daniel's deeper, larger ones. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of snow beneath her boots. She called Daniel's name again, her voice echoing through the trees. Finally, she saw him. He was standing in a small clearing, perfectly still, his back to her. His flashlight dangled loosely from one hand, the beam aimed at the ground. Daniel, Ellie shouted, relief flooding her voice. She hurried toward him, but as she drew closer, she noticed something was wrong. "Daniel," she said again, softer this time. She reached out to touch his arm, and he flinched, turning to face her. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. What's wrong?" Ellie asked, her heart pounding. Daniel pointed to the ground in front of him. Ellie followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. A doll lay in the snow. It was old and filthy, its porcelain face cracked and yellowed with age. But what made Ellie's blood run cold was its eyes, two gleaming black beads that seemed to watch her. Clutched in its tiny hands was a piece of paper, folded neatly. Ellie hesitated before bending to pick it up. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, revealing a single word scrawled in dark red ink. "Welcome." "We need to go," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Daniel didn't argue. He seemed dazed, almost in a trance, as Ellie pulled him by the arm, dragging him back through the woods. The footprints, both theirs and the child's, had vanished as though erased by some unseen hand. When they finally burst through the cabin door, Ellie slammed it shut and locked it, her chest heaving with panic. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. "Pack your stuff. We're not staying here another night." But before Daniel could respond, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, building in intensity until it became a deafening roar. The cabin shook violently, and Ellie screamed as the windows shattered, spraying glass across the floor. And then, silence. The hum stopped. The shaking ceased. Ellie and Daniel looked at each other, their faces pale and stricken. "What the hell was that?" Daniel whispered. Ellie didn't answer. She was staring at the center of the room, where the fire had gone out completely. In its place was a single object, a doll, identical to the one in the woods. Its black bead eyes glinted in the dim light, and its cracked porcelain mouth was twisted into what could only be described as a smile. The hum started again. Ellie grabbed Daniel's hand and ran, pulling him out the door and into the snow. They didn't stop, didn't look back, as they fled down the mountain road. The snow was deep, and their progress was slow, but adrenaline kept them going. Finally, they reached the main road. Ellie flagged down a passing car, barely able to explain what had happened through her sobs. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, offered them a ride to town. As they drove, Ellie glanced back toward the cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, but she could have sworn she saw something standing on the porch. A figure, small, in a tattered white nightgown. It was waving.